Welcome back. Former Prime Minister Boris Johnson on Tuesday faced a grilling by a panel of MPs over accusations that he did not tell the truth to Parliament over Partygate. He was questioned by the Privileges Committee over how he could not have known that various events, including leaving DOS and breached guidance and rules. Mr. Johnson swore on a Bible at the start of that session that he will tell the truth. He insisted that he did not lie to the House of Commons. It is a significant moment for a political system such as the UK that largely relies on trust to function. It could also be a big moment for Mr. Boris Johnson personally and his political future.
I apologise for inadvertently misleading this House, but to say that I did it recklessly or deliberately is completely untrue, as the evidence shows. Whatever we got wrong, I believe that officials in Number 10 and the Cabinet Office, indeed all Whitehall departments, should be immensely proud of their efforts to protect this country from a loathsome disease. What I thought was that we had done our best to implement the guidance, and in fact had thoroughly and completely implemented the guidance, but clearly when it came to things like social distancing, as the guidance explicitly provides for, it was not possible at all times to have perfect social distancing, and that you could have mitigations. These events were, of course, not organised by me personally. I relied upon my excellent officials to make sure that we had the right people in the room. On my birthday, I'd come back from a long external visit. I thought it was reasonably necessary for work purposes because I was standing at my desk surrounded by officials who'd been asked to come and wish me a happy birthday. I'd only recently recovered from an illness, from COVID, and it seemed to me to be a perfectly proper thing to do. We were about to have another meeting, and they were very largely the same officials.
Dr. Nigel Fletcher, political historian and lecturer of politics and contemporary history at the King's College London, joins us now for more on this. Thank you very much, Dr. Fletcher, for joining us on The World Today.
Pleasure.
Now, what do you make of the about 3.5-hour grilling of Mr. Boris Johnson by the Privileges Committee? What were the big moments for you in that process?
Well, I mean, it was a very long session, as you say, and I have to say I had to take a call during the middle of it and came back and they were still going. So, yes, it was, I think what was interesting about it really was the fact that for the whole of that 3-hour session, Boris Johnson was having to defend a very particular line of arguments that he was making that effectively relied on the fact that he had a different interpretation of the guidance that he had been telling the whole country was really important for them to follow. And, you know, I thought during the course of that, it became increasingly implausible, I think, really, that he could have believed that. And that certainly seemed to be what the committee was viewing it as being as well, that this was a very difficult argument to accept, that someone who, as they played repeatedly, you know, in the committee, had stood behind a podium telling the British people that it was very important for them to follow the guidance, laying out specifically what that meant in terms of social distancing and mitigations. And yet he was claiming for 3 hours yesterday that as it applied to Downing Street, he thought it had a different meaning. And I think that's really what the committee are going to have real difficulty accepting. The idea that when he made the assurances that he did in Parliament about the events that centred around Partygate, that his understanding of the guidance being met was very different to how everyone else would have viewed it.
Well, I mean, we did see that the former leader at a time lost his cool a few times. But, you know, Mr. Johnson, he's a very charismatic speaker. Do you think he's been able to talk his way out of this?
Well, this is the interesting thing, is that, you know, we are used to seeing Boris being sort of, you know, being Boris and putting on this sort of performance. I think it was a very different example of Boris Johnson that we saw yesterday. You know, over that period of time, it's not possible to keep up that sort of jovial exterior for that length of time. And as you say, there were a number of occasions when he clearly got very frustrated by by the questioning. But again, I think he had to maintain this one argument that he was putting about what was in his mind when he made the assurances to Parliament that, as far as he put it, guidance was followed at all times. And to sustain that under questioning for that length of time would be difficult for anyone. But as anyone who's had to ever sort of brief Boris Johnson for meetings will tell you, keeping him to a particular line and ensuring that he doesn't stray beyond it is very difficult indeed. And so I think there are a number of moments where there's clips circulating on social media of his lawyer sitting behind him, looking slightly pained at some of the things he was saying. I think it was a real challenge for him. It wasn't the kind of event that plays to his strengths as a communicator. He operates much better where he's able to sort of be a sort of jovial, freewheeling speaker, and sort of telling jokes. The idea of having to sit in front of a committee answering very sustained questions, I think, was very difficult for him to sustain.
Now, what happens next? Where does this leave Boris Johnson and his political future?
Well, I think the answer to that is it leaves it hanging in the balance. We have to wait to see what the committee will find in their final report. They were very clear at the meeting that they're taking evidence from Boris Johnson, but they will take some time to consider that alongside all of the other evidence that they've gathered. But they will come to a conclusion about what they believe the truth of the matter is as to whether he deliberately misled Parliament. And that's what's at the centre of this. This was not an inquiry into whether the rules were broken. Everyone agrees that they were. The question is whether he deliberately misled the House of Commons. And if they find that he did, they've got a really difficult decision. Because if they suspend him from the House of Commons and take that sanction for more than 10 days, then there will be the option of a recall petition, and that will inevitably happen if that's the case. And he will face a by-election. He will have to face an election in his seat, which I think in the current circumstances, it's very unlikely that the Conservative Party will be able to win that. So the stakes are extremely high. And if the committee find that he deliberately misled Parliament, or even recklessly misled Parliament, then they will have to decide whether to go as far as that, and if they do, then his career as a Conservative MP is potentially very much under threat.
Oh. Now, could we see more of such sittings by the Privileges Committee, seeing as even the current Prime Minister, Rishi Sunak, has in the past been fined for breaking COVID rules? What do you think will happen?
Well, there is a difference between standards and privileges. The committees have sometimes done both jobs, but this is the Privileges Committee, which looks specifically at the issue of contempt of the House of Commons. And by that, they mean things like misleading the House on purpose and that kind of thing. So things like being fined for breaking COVID regulations, as Rishi Sunak was, will be covered by other things, like if there's a standards issue around that. Privileges Committee, however, is about misleading the House of Commons. And there has been a lot of discussion about whether this should set a precedent in future for other people who might have been accused of misleading the House of Commons, either intentionally or deliberately, that perhaps we will see more of this in the future, where somebody comes to the House of Commons and says something which later turns out not to be true. They do have an obligation to come back and correct the record. But if it's found that they deliberately misled the House of Commons, as we're seeing, that's a very serious matter. And there have been suggestions from some people that perhaps this is something that needs to be applied on a more regular basis. It's one of the things you can't do in the House of Commons is accuse somebody of lying, because the assumption is that everyone will tell the truth to Parliament. Well, as we've seen, sometimes that doesn't happen. We've just seen the anniversary, by the way, of the Profumo scandal, which was perhaps the most famous incident of a minister misleading the House of Commons and lying to Parliament. And I think it's possible in future we will see more of these sorts of hearings when people are accused of doing the same thing.
Yeah. All right, thank you very much, Dr. Nigel Fletcher, political historian and lecturer of politics and contemporary history at the King's College London. Thank you for your time on The World Today.
Thank you.
In the meantime, British Prime Minister Rishi Sunak says that he is very pleased with the level of support for his reworked Brexit deal when a large majority of lawmakers voted in favour of the stormont element of the Windsor framework. Mr. Sunak won the backing of Parliament for a key element of a reworked post-Brexit deal on Northern Ireland, and despite opposition from the province's biggest unionist party and some of his lawmakers. He has tried to end years of wrangling over the Brexit deal by revisiting one of the trickiest parts of the negotiations to ensure smooth trade to Northern Ireland without creating a hard border with Britain or with the European Union member Ireland.
I was really pleased yesterday that there was very strong support for the Windsor framework, and that's because it's the right deal for Northern Ireland. It's good for families, for people, for businesses, for communities across Northern Ireland. It restores the balance in the Belfast Good Friday Agreement, secures Northern Ireland's place in our precious union, and makes sure that Northern Ireland has proper sovereignty. That's why it's a good deal. I'm pleased that it commanded broad support, and we can look forward to a better and brighter future.
Away from the UK now, a senior US official has said the United States does not seem an imminent threat to China invading Taiwan, but aggressive expansion of the Indo-Pacific is damaging regional stability. On the sidelines of the Defense Technology Conference in Singapore, U.S. Air Force Secretary Frank Kendall said that China has done a number of things that are fairly aggressive, including militarizing the South China Sea, a strategic trade corridor in which several countries have overlapping claims.
What we all hope for is peace and stability in the region and continuing essentially the status quo. China has done a number of things that are fairly aggressive in the region. The South China Sea, obviously expanding their role there and militarizing that. They've had some much more aggressive behaviors around Taiwan with regard to the Senkakus as well. So Chinese behavior has not, in many cases, been consistent with keeping a stable situation here and not appearing to be threatening to some of the other nations in the region. The U.S. is working closely with its partners here. We have close relationships with a number of states in the Indo-Pacific. We cooperate with them routinely, and that cooperation is expanding. Those balloons are not what I would consider a very serious military threat at all, but they are an example of the kind of aggressive behaviors that I think are counterproductive, quite frankly. I don't anticipate that China will be doing anything like that again anytime soon. Hopefully that's the case. The U.S. is going to protect its sovereignty.
Meanwhile, Taiwan's armed forces held joint anti-landing exercises close to Taoyuan International Airport in the north of the island. The drills come amid heightened military posturing and threat towards Taiwan by its giant neighbor China. Amphibious vehicles were released at sea and even made landing on a beach while soldiers pretending to be the enemy forces tried to advance into rural residential areas before being met with tanks and armored vehicles. Military tensions between Beijing and Taipei are on their highest point in decades as China tries to force Taiwan into accepting Chinese rules. Taiwan's democratically elected government strongly rejects China's sovereignty claims, saying that only the island's people can decide their own future. Dumpsters burned in the middle of the French protesters entering the 9th day of strikes against a deadly unpopular bill to raise the pension age, while video shows burning makeshift roadblock and emitting large plume of smoke while cars queued up behind it. French President Emmanuel Macron said the legislation, which his government pushed through parliament without a vote last week, will come into force by end of year, despite escalating anger across the country. Protests against the policy changes, which lifts the retirement age by 2 years to the age of 64 and accelerate an increase in the number of years one must work to draw a full pension, have drawn huge crowds and rallies organized by unions since January this year. In the meantime, train services were disrupted, some schools were shut, while garbage piled up on the streets of France as protests continues. One train out of 3 was circulating at St. Lazarus train station, and SNCF warned that traffic will remain disrupted until Friday this week. Most protests have been peaceful, but anger has mounted since the government pushed the bill through Parliament without a vote last week. The past 7 nights have seen spontaneous demonstrations in Paris and other cities, with waste bins set ablaze and scuffles with the police. Away from France now, Lebanese security forces have fired tear gas at hundreds of protesters, mostly retired members of the security forces who have gathered near government buildings in Beirut in anger at deteriorating economic conditions. Crowds gathered in the streets of downtown Beirut between parliament and the government's Cyril. But they carried Lebanon's tricolor flags bearing logos of security forces. They are outraged at the deteriorating value of the state pensions paid in the local currency. The pound has lost more than 98% of its value against the US dollar since 2019. Lebanon's economic meltdown began in 2019 after decades of alleged corruption. The country's top financial and political leaders have allowed the crisis to fester, with the Lebanese pound hitting an all-time low of 140,000 to the US dollar on Tuesday before an intervention by the country's central bank. Authorities in Iran have committed violations in recent months, and that may amount to crimes against humanity. Well, that's according to a UN-appointed expert, citing cases of murder, imprisonment, enforced disappearances, torture, rape, sexual violence, and persecution. Iran has been swept by protests since the death of a young Iranian Kurdish woman, Mahsa Amini, in custody just last September. Addressing a Geneva-based council, Javaid Rehman, the special rapporteur on the situation of human rights in Iran, said that he had evidence that Ms. Amini had died as a result of beatings by the state morality police.
My report to this council in March 2022 and my current report firmly establishes my conclusions that there is absence of accountability for serious human rights violations and for crimes under international law within the political, constitutional, and legal system of Iran. The scale and gravity of the violations committed by Iranian authorities, especially since the death of Ms. Amini, points to the possible commission of international crimes, notably the crimes against humanity of murder, imprisonment, enforced disappearances, torture, rape, and sexual violence, and persecution. In addition to the unfolding tragedies since 16 September, I remain deeply concerned at the continuing and exponentially increasing violations of human rights in the country. This includes a sharp increase in executions, particularly upsurge in the execution of drug offenders, the continuous execution of persons sentenced to death as children, resumption of public executions, and the disproportionate use of death penalty against persons belonging to ethnic and religious minorities in 2022. At least 500 persons, including 2 persons sentenced as children, and 13 women were executed in 2022, the highest number of executions in the past 5 years. Since January 2023, 143 persons have already been executed following grossly unfair trials. Security forces have fired live ammunition, birdshot, and other metal pellets directly at unarmed and peaceful protesters, among them many children and youth who pose no imminent threat to life or serious injury, as well as at bystanders and those who were running away. Protesters, including children, were beaten to death. At least 527 people, including 71 children, were killed, and hundreds of protesters severely injured.
When we return in just a moment, we might have a new sport on the horizon as jet suit inventor Richard Browning reveals plans to form an international race series. Please stay with us. Welcome back. You're still watching The World Today on Channels Television. Let's continue with a building that collapsed in Qatar's capital, Doha, killing at least 1 person. Rescuers are now searching the rubble to check for more survivors. Qatar's Interior Ministry described the building as a 4-story structure in Doha's Bin Dorman neighborhood. It said the rescuers found 7 survivors, while the 1 person killed was inside the building at the time of the collapse. Online video shows car alarms sounding after the collapse, with one part of the building falling into another nearby. Pope Francis has appealed against the waste of water on World Water Day and prayed for the success of the United Nations 2023 Water Conference to be held in New York. Latin America's first pope, who took his name from St. Francis of Assisi, the patron saint of ecology. Pope Francis made the protection of the environment a key plank of his pontificate. While since becoming pope in 2013, he has repeatedly asked governments to take drastic measures to combat global warming and reduce the use of fossil fuels. And in 2015, he wrote a landmark encyclical on the need to protect nature. The European Commission has proposed rules that will require companies in Europe to back up climate-friendly claims about their products with evidence to stamp out misleading green labels for products from clothing to cosmetics and electronic goods. The proposed measure will regulate labels like natural, climate neutral, or having recycled content. And it will tackle what the EU says, the rampant greenwashing among products sold in Europe. The use of such labels, a company must carry out a science-based assessment, assessing all significant environmental impacts to prove that its product lives up to the claim or have it verified under an environmental labeling scheme.
The products that are sold with labels that says eco, green, good for the environment, climate friendly, and so on, if they have no scientific backing and transparent methodology behind it, they would not be allowed to use. This is a voluntary scheme, so businesses choose if they want to go this way for one or the other product for the whole company, but is a must if you want to use one or the other label. Today we have excellent companies, SMEs, who's been going that extra mile for that green claim and ensuring that consumers have really a green product, climate neutral, biodiversity friendly. But they've had to compete with those who've been openly cutting corners and basically laughing at face of consumers and the competitors. So we finally stepped in, and we will have the regulation which will ensure a level playing field.
Cooperation between China and Africa is at a critical stage of movement to a higher level as China remains ready to work with African countries to overcome problems and challenges in innovative cooperation ideas and diversifying cooperation models under the framework of the Forum of China-Africa Cooperation. And this is thought and opinion of Wu Peng, who's the Director General of the Department of African Affairs at China's Ministry of Foreign Affairs during a proposal meeting of a report on Chinese investment in Africa 2023. Our Foreign Affairs correspondent, Amarachi Ubani, was there and now reports.
China prides itself as one of Africa's largest and strongest trading partners, and by far its largest trading partner in agricultural goods. During a meeting focused on promoting the development of African industrial chain and enhancing the added value of African products seminar and proposal meeting of reports on Chinese investments in Africa, attended by diplomats and Chinese business leaders, Mr. Wu, speaking in Mandarin, reiterated China's increasing partnerships with Africa in all aspects, investing more than $120 billion and financing cooperation with African countries to improve their infrastructure and consolidate the foundation of industrialization. In his presentation given in French language, co-chair of the Forum on China-Africa Cooperation, FOCAC, who's also Senegal's ambassador to China, Mr. Ibrahim Silla, corroborated Mr. Wu's submission of cooperation between China and Africa, adding that Africa's goals of industrialization are stated in the AU's Agenda 2063. He raises a concern, however, of Africa's exports to China, which model is still at the level of mineral resources and agricultural products. Among the lineup of speakers is the UN resident coordinator in China, Mr. Siddharth Chatterjee, who announces the UN's next line of action, the setting up of an SDG fund.
What I'm now doing is establishing a joint Sustainable Development Goal Fund, into which I will attract catalytic financing in order to give velocity to countries in our South-South cooperation framework, to bring provide the best technical guidance, and drive and support private enterprise, state enterprise, governments to look at where we can do big ticket items. And why am I saying this? In the next 7 years, agribusiness in Africa is going to be $1 trillion worth.
The meeting then goes into keynote speeches where the CEO, Development Reimagined, Hannah Ryder, proposes an agreement between China's Belt and Road Initiative with Africa's Continental Free Trade Agreement area as solution to increasing African exports to China.
A preferential agreement that links China's Belt and Road Initiative to the entire African Continental Free Trade area, with zero tariffs on raw and value-added products from every single African country is crucial and will help to shift these kinds of patterns. This is also why, as agreed in the FOCAC 2021 Action Plan, progress on negotiating geographical indications is necessary to also protect the value of African raw agricultural products, from coffee to wine, cotton, kente, which I'm wearing right now, into China.
For Chinese businesses in Africa, policy stabilization is a key factor to help speed up industrial growth.
We need a clear industry policy, and that policy is supposed to be sustainable.
Coming just weeks after China's political season, Chinese and African leaders will continue to engage on a deeper level to ensure a workable plan to help the continent achieve its industrialization goals. From Beijing, China, I'm Amarachi Ibani, Channels Television News.
The inventor of the jet suit, Richard Browning, has revealed plans to form an international race series with celebrities and sporting personalities pushing the limits of psychics and of physics in particular and spectacular waterfront locations worldwide. The plan will see pilots racing at about 1,500 BP jet suits also against each other, and the clock over the racing course with floating gates. And chief test pilot of the Gravity Industries, Richard Browning, said that the water park west of London will be the venue. Laguna Park was where the jet suit set its first Guinness World Speed record of a mere 32 miles per hour in 2018, which is a record that was upstaged to 85 in the year 2019.
So in terms of the race series, we're very excited about this. I mean, we're actually here today kind of showcasing some of the elements of what that's going to consist of. But it's just going to be a really fascinating melting pot of human and machine against each other, seeing how fast and how far you can push those boundaries, but in a safe environment over water. The format of the race series is going to consist of guys and girls, many of which you might notice are familiar faces, joining together in iconic locations over water, pushing the boundaries of human and machine technology. It's going to look like a mashup of the kind of Red Bull Air Race meets, I suppose, a Marvel superhero film. In terms of participants in the race series, it's going to be a mixture of some of our medic and military professionals pushing their skills, but also some of our trained members of the public and clients who want to push those boundaries and experience something like they've never tasted before.
It definitely will be an interesting sport, but that's all we draw the cuttings on the world today. Thank you so much for watching. I'm Anne Nwawadu. Please stay safe.